Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. And with that, just be aware everything's getting recorded. All right, so I want to welcome everybody to our seminar series on extremism, fanaticism, targeted violence, and domestic and international terrorism. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Gisela Bichler. She's coming to us from Cal State San Bernardino. She's been there since 2000 after she completed her graduate studies at Rutgers University. Her research explores the interplay between the environment and then offending behavior. A major focus of her research investigates how social networks shape crime opportunities and how this information can be harnessed to prevent crime, disrupt illicit markets, and resolve community crime problems. This practical approach to research is reflected in our ongoing analytic work with law enforcement and involvement with the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing. She explores the utility of social network analysis in considerable detail in her outstanding book titled Understanding Criminal Networks, a research guide. Hopefully this is a good plug for you and you can get a few more sales. And that's available through the University of California Press and Amazon. I actually put in an order for myself, so that should be fun. She's authored over 50 research articles and books, and her recent publications are applying network analysis to gang violence, illicit markets, terrorism, and appear in the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, Global Crime, Homicide Studies, and Trends in Organized Crime. So we really do have a great speaker with us today. And what I'm going to do before I'll hand it over in 1 second, I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, just type the gist of the question to me. And then what we'll do is we'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question to Dr. Bichler. Dr. Bichler, one question. Would you like to hold questions till the very end, or can folks pepper them in?
I think if they're clarifying questions, it's probably better to pepper them in. So
okay.
That I respond right when it comes up as opposed to later and it might get lost.
Excellent. Yeah. All right. So if you got a clarifying question, feel free to just chat, message me really fast, and I'll unmute you so you can sort of pop up. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. Dr. Bichler, thank you very much. And I'm excited to hear your talk.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now, so hopefully that works. Make you small. Go over here and put it into this format. So you should be able to see a full screen and a little head someplace else, I think. Does that work?
Yep, we're good.
All right. So I'm going to make the assumption today that I'm talking to folks that might be excited or intrigued by the idea of doing criminal network analysis, but haven't really got into it. If you are well advanced in the field, I apologize. I just figured that it's better to get us all on the same page. And one of the things that kind of drives the work that I've been doing recently is that whenever we're borrowing, I use that term loosely, sometimes we steal. Whenever we're borrowing analytics from other fields, sometimes we have the challenge of trying to make them work with the kinds of data we're working with. And that can be daunting. And sometimes you end up with your head in your hands an awful lot trying to figure out what to do. So the gist of this presentation is to give you some ideas about how to overcome some of those challenges that you may face as you get into this. And that should make it much more enjoyable for you to do some work with this data. So the subtext to this is challenges and opportunities. And really what we're going to do is we're going to turn challenges into opportunities. From what I understand, the series focuses about applying big data techniques to unique data sets. And when we get into criminal justice and covert networks, we're dealing with very special data sets that have unique properties. And we need to understand those properties if we're going to assist Homeland Security and advance Homeland Security objectives. So what we're dealing with here is a situation. We often think that we've got the network mapped. And here I'm representing a network of just two people. This is a simple dyad. with two people connected by some sort of a linkage. There's no directionality to the linkage. A channel exists between these two individuals. Let's say they're associates. But the problem is that we're often dealing with dynamic covert operations, and sometimes it's difficult to map those networks. Our idea is that we think if we understand how the network is shaped, we can start to implement tactics to disrupt the behavior we're trying to quieten down. So we're either trying to break the relationship that exists between these two operatives, or we might be trying to target a certain individual that we think influences many others, and therefore may we be able to disrupt illicit markets or market activity by removing them from the network. The underlying assumption of borrowing all these techniques from analytics, from network analytics, is that structure matters. And in this image, you see two different network structures. The person of interest, or our focal individual, is shaded in gray. And in each of the scenarios, they have a very different network structure that surrounds them. In the first one, we've got a situation where the person is embedded. And in fact, we use the word constrained. They're constrained by their network because ideas, opportunities, information flows through that network. And if they have this new thing that they want to do, but they don't have support from the rest of the group, it's going to be very difficult to do that. Contrast that to the situation in panel B, where the individual has access to two very different groups that are not connected. And one person or one group may not support their idea, but another does, and therefore they have the means and the support to implement whatever it is they're planning to implement. Intuitively, you can look at this and think, which network would you like to be in? Which one gives you more advantages or opportunities? Well, network A is actually more resilient because of all that's constraint. It's very difficult to disrupt, but it is inflexible. It doesn't have the ability to adapt to new situations. So what we normally find with covert networks or dark networks is they like to look more like B, in the sense that they have access to flows of different information and opportunities that might be traveling through the network. They tend to be easier to disrupt, but because there are a few connections among people that we know about, they're harder to identify and map. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, what is it really, what's the problem here, right? We've got all these wonderful analytics that we can use. Most of the software is in a button-friendly Windows format, so it makes it really easy to do things. Well, the problem that we're really dealing with is the issue of challenges, right? So the analytics that we like to import and use have certain data requirements. And if we don't meet those data requirements, it really questions the utility of doing any analysis with this in terms of mapping and understanding how the network works. The underlying most important thing you need to gain from this is that to really fully work with network analytics, you have to have complete networks, complete network information, which means you need to know all the actors and ties that exist within the set of people that are supposed to be involved in the network. But when we're dealing with covert operations, we're always dealing with unknowns, right? We can see something above the surface, but there's an awful lot that happens below that we don't really know for certain. We don't know all of the actors that are involved. We don't know how they're involved. We don't know the connections among them. And then we're also dealing with issues of systematic bias, where the agency focus and the resources they can put into their operations will filter or constrain some of the information that we have. What that leaves us with is this problem, right? We don't know what % of the network we actually are looking at. And that creates a major issue. We don't know how much we can trust our results. So the crux of the problem is we need to figure out to what extent we're missing information. So when you map a network and you think it looks like this, but in reality, it could look like is this, very different. We have a third operative here that is connected to both others. It's a very cohesive network, and if we're trying to disrupt them, we might take out this relationship, but we haven't stopped the operations. If we change our focus to take out an individual that we think is most central to the network, again, we may break a few extra ties that we didn't know about, but the network itself still remains intact and can still function. This is a very simple dynamic diagram because we're only dealing with 3 people here. In reality, we have many more individuals. So how do we deal with these challenges? How do we understand the limitations of our data and then use network analytic tools to actually do something useful? I draw a lesson from rock climbing. One of the first things that you learn when you first get on a rock is that you don't need to take big steps. So when you get on a rock, you get into a position almost always, doesn't matter how experienced a climber is, where you think that you can't do anything. You can't move any further up the wall. You've got no place to put your hands. You've got no place to put your feet. And what the first thing everybody tells you is just look for something small. All you need is a couple of inches, just a little bit of a step. And what happens is when you take that small step, you end up finding major footholds and handholds that you can use. And that's what I want to provide you with today, is a few footholds and handholds, a little different perspective that may help you when you come into those challenges and you're trying to use network analytics and the data that you have aren't complete. So what I'm really doing is I'm recasting the challenges that we have into opportunities by creating or drawing your attention to new ways we can use the tools. So the two major issues we're dealing with is this notion of incomplete networks. And the subsidiary issue is that of quality of data. Our data are not the best. So I'm going to offer you today 4 different opportunities that you could use to overcome some of these challenges. And the first one has to do with bipart graphs. I'm hoping that in doing so, I'm going to help you get off that rock and get up there. So sometimes what happens is we are really focused on trying to get the connections between 2 individuals or among a set of individuals. But what we have as an opportunity is the idea of not connecting people directly to each other, but connecting people to either events or activities or groups. It's called a Twomode network. Bipart graphs is the fancy term, but really what you're dealing with is affiliations that could exist between people. So what we do is we take each entity that we know about and we map their connection to groups or affiliations or events, and then we derive the connections between people to map out the probability that they know each other. So we're actually reconfiguring and creating a person-to-person network based on the linkages that might exist between them. And it would look something like this. If you have 3 individuals under surveillance and you're watching different meetings, let's say they're organized crime groups, and you find that Alex has been to all 3 meetings and Casey has only been to 1. The chances that the 2 of them know each other are much smaller than between Alex and Bruce, because Alex and Bruce have been to all 3 meetings. So what we can do is we can take this information and we can restructure it so it looks more like this. We are more confident about the connection between Alex and Bruce because we've seen them attend the same 3 events. We're less confident about the relationship between Alex and Bruce and Casey because they've only been witnessed to attend the same 1 event. So what we're doing here is we're weighting the ties among people based on the probability or the likelihood that they actually may be connected to each other. We can use that in different ways. So for instance, here's an example where we tried to figure out the working relationships among police officers. So it's not a covert network per se, but what we want to know is there some sort of a way of dealing with particular issues? In this case, we were looking at homelessness in a city that thought they had an issue that they wanted to deal with the problem-oriented policing project. And they wanted to select officers that knew about boots on the ground officers that knew what was going on. So what you see here are circles that represent officers. The connections between the officers are them attending a call for service together. So call for service, a CFS, if you're not familiar with that term, is like a 911 call. So they've been called to attend the scene, and these are all issues connected to homeless individuals in the city. The thicker the line, the more calls. So you see that there are 2 individuals, Barron and Gill, kind of upwards in the center of the graph, that have a very thick line between them. That means that over the course of a 2.5-year period, they spent a lot of time working together with homeless issues in the community, which means you want 1 or both of these individuals involved in your problem-oriented policing team because they've got a lot of knowledge about what's going on. You also see in the bottom right-hand side of the graph, well, my right anyway, another line which might actually represent a different shift. And it turns out that Barron and Gill were on day shift and the other two were actually on a swing shift. So if you want to have a full understanding of the issues that are going on, you would want at least one person from each of these different sets. Now, the other thing you notice is that some actors have larger circles than others, and that has to do with how many people or how many different people they've worked with. And if we strip away some of the lighter ties or situations where only people have only worked together once or twice, you end up getting a much clearer picture of the potential working relationships within this organization that you might want to tap into in order to resolve a community crime problem. Now, we can also do this looking at crime issues. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is a project called Pivot that was done in Cincinnati. They were trying to deal with illicit markets, particularly drug markets, and the gun violence that was associated with this problem. What they decided to do is to map the connectivity between places, because they had done a very targeted strategy to remove some of the most violent offenders in the community, but the crime returned. And the reason why the crime returned and the issues remained was that they didn't disrupt the market's ability to rebuild itself after certain key players were taken out. So what they did instead is they said, well, all of these different locations are important to the flow of drugs in the community and the sales of drugs. So they mapped places based on the connections that a certain individual would go to both, right? So if they had 10 different drug dealers and they all use these different places, you end up getting a map. And by simplifying it, you'd look like something like this. So you end up getting very different types of locations that were critical to supporting the drug market and enabling different operators to actually work together to rebuild the market if something happened. So what they ended up doing was doing a series of place-based targeted strategies to make these locations unhospitable to hanging out and supporting the drug market. And that was the way that they were able to break this particular drug problem in the community. If you want to learn more about the Pivot project, then I would highly recommend it. There are some sources here listed on the slide, and I'll make these slides available. There's also a 35-minute podcast, which I would highly recommend. Tamara Madison, actually it's Tamara Harold now. Dr. Harold was involved in the original project, and she speaks very well about it. It's the number 5 podcast in the Reducing Crime series, and I would strongly recommend, if you have some time, to take a look at this, because she'll explain in more detail how they were able to deal with this drug market. So now we have one opportunity, right? We can take information about people's behavior in terms of their attendance in meetings or their frequenting of different places, and we can turn that into a network that we can actually do something with. So even though we don't have information about all the players, we can start using some probability to figure out who might be connected or what places might be connected, and we can deal with those. So now we have our first step in getting up that rock wall. The second thing that we can do is not actually focus on the whole network characteristics, but we can spend more time looking at the shift in actor scores. And this idea comes from a professor that's been doing a lot of work in Italy looking at the mafia. And what he suggested is, if we look at the shifting score or relative importance of an individual over time, irrespective of how that network changes, we might be able to uncover emerging leadership, or we may be able to track how a network responds or changes to targeted attacks. So to give you an example of what this might look like, I'm drawing from some work that we did looking at serial murder. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Green River Killer, but there was a serial killer operating in the Seattle-Tacoma area for approximately 20 years. And in the first 4 or 5 years of this case, there's a lot of information generated, and the task forces that were involved were huge. They had tremendous amount of resources, and post hoc examinations of these networks have discovered that there was a lot of investigative failure that happened, a lot of failures where the actual perpetrator was not overlooked, but was pushed to the side in favor of a different suspect. So we thought, well, what if we actually created networks that looked at all the different people that were identified and tried to see whether or not there was more reason to believe that Gary was the person that we should have been looking at all along. So how did we do that? We took all the information about individuals identified connected to places that were critical to this investigation. So again, we're using this two-mode network. And then we derive a network of person-to-person based on the fact that people shared the same locations. We split that information into 6-month intervals for the first few years of the investigation to see whether or not the suspects changed their position. So this is an image from the first 6 months of the investigation. Your diamonds are suspects. The circles that are colored in gray are victims. The circles that are colored in white are others that are involved in the investigation in some way. So for instance, they could be a body finder. They could manage the motel where the person was last seen. All of the victims in this case were active prostitutes working in the area. So there could have been individuals that were that saw them on the strip somewhere. The person in the center was the individual that was identified in the very beginning as being the prime suspect. I'm sorry, it was a cat. And in the next 6 months, what you're going to see is there's a shift. So as more and more information is developed and we find more individuals that are connected to the case and the commonalities or the overlapping activity spaces of these individuals, we find that there's a shift in who's more central. So we have a victim here within the first year that becomes really important because they share the most overlapping activity space with everybody else. Well, a victim's not going to be the perpetrator, right? So we keep looking. Now, if we compare, you'll see by 18 months, there's a shift in those two primary suspects. The one in the center of your graph has now diminished in terms of importance and linking different people from different victims. And the other person has now become prominent. Over time, the networks become saturated and becomes a little harder to see who's more prominent. But if I show you the statistics that underlie these images, what you're going to see is in that third time period, Gary pops as being the most central individual in this investigation. Now, his scores start to diminish over time as the network becomes more saturated and it's harder to actually identify relatively unique positions. But something like this approach might have shifted the momentum of the investigation, and maybe folks would have been able to spend a little bit more time looking into him in the early days. So hopefully now you've seen two different ways of thinking about these data problems, right? We've got a situation where we have incomplete information, so we derive a person-to-person network looking at who's connecting to who's potentially connected to somebody else based on shared meetings. And now we've also looking at shifts in centrality positions or shifts in actor positions within those networks over time, and that can give us some new information, even though we know the networks themselves are not complete. The third thing that we can do is something called multiplexity. Multiplexity is this idea that we all have different connections. And sometimes we may have multiple connections to one person. So if you think about a situation where an individual works with a relative, right, they have two connections. They have a business or a working relationship with that person. They also have a kinship relationship. You could also find people that have 3 relationships. So they have a kinship, they have a legitimate working relationship, and they co-offend together. If we map both the deviant connections among people and also the legitimate ties, we actually capture a more complete network of potential resources and influence. Now, why is that important? We've done some network analytics. We've applied network analytics to terrorist activity. And what we find is that sometimes, right before a major attack, terrorist groups will operationalize or will ignite latent ties, meaning they draw upon resources and individuals that they know from a past situation that they're not currently active with in order to accomplish their tasks. So when you create a situation where you're mapping not just the current active relationships, but these potential relationships that may exist that could be used in a pinch, then you actually have more complete information and you're in a better position to estimate or gauge how that network's going to respond and what's going to happen. So you can think of it this way, right? You've got family connections, employment connections, co-offending, and other types of connections. And when you glue it all together, you create this more complete network structure. How can we use this? Well, we pulled some information from a threat assessment. This threat assessment is an annual activity that generates information about everybody involved in organized crime. And what it does, I can't give you too many details, but what it does is it harvests all the information about the relationships among all of the key actors that are thought to be involved in organized crime. And in the narratives, you'll find information about co-offending activity, being co-arrested, being connected to the same formal organized crime group, kinship relations, legitimate associates, enemy ties, and other things. And when you harvest all the information, all the linkages among all the different individuals, you can actually treat this as separate networks and analyze them separately, or you can analyze it as a total network, all integrated. The network that we were looking at had 2,197 people in it, and there were quite a few ties because we had multiple relationships between people. The vast majority of these individuals were involved in drug crime, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But what you notice in this graphic is that when we look at the top key players, so the 10 individuals that are the most central in the organization or the networks in terms of having the most influence on everybody else, you'll notice that some of the people, they're represented by numbers here, repeat. They show up in the top 10 lists, and it doesn't matter what kinds of relationships we're looking at. They're important in all aspects. But you'll also notice that kinship doesn't seem to have that pattern. You've got a bunch of individuals identified that are connected to these drug-involved individuals, but those people don't show up in the other networks. Not so much, right? Well, there's another piece to this. Those 10 individuals were actually directly linked to 252 individuals involved in organized crime, drug trafficking and organized crime. And one of the ones that was really interesting was a grandmother. And you would think to yourself, why is the grandmother popping up as being so important? Well, that grandmother was linked to major operatives in the outlaw motorcycle club that was the focus of this threat assessment. So you could just imagine family reunions and funerals and holiday dinners, right? Where you've got this grandmother who's connected to different individuals that are running different chapters of this organization that then communicate with each other over a family dinner, right? So it's like, hey, I've got this problem. I've got a shipment that's supposed to be coming in, but my helicopter pilot can't do it. I need somebody else to smuggle it across the border. Do you know anybody? Oh, sure, we've got somebody you can use. So this is this issue of these latent ties, right? So this kinship connection actually brings people together and helps the sharing of resources that actually enables the drug trafficking to continue when problems arise. And that's really the key point here, is that when we have multiplex information, we know different types of linkages among individuals. We can actually look at this information in different ways in order to understand what could be a potential reaction to our efforts to try and stop their behavior. So now we're getting towards the top of our climb. We're starting to feel a bit better, I hope, that we've got different things that we can do to deal with the fact that we have incomplete and sometimes horrible data. The final thing I want to bring to your attention is this idea of attributes. So far I've been just talking about people and the connections that they may have between them. But we can also capture information about those individuals and about the relations that we can use to better understand the patterns that we find in the network activity. So to give you an example here, I'm using UN Office of Drug Control incident level data. There's roughly 7 years of data available. Some of 2010's data is not that great, but we'll just say there's 7 years of data available. We're looking at over 658,000 seizures. And the seizures are reported by different countries each year. So at the lowest we've got is 1 year we have 39 countries reporting, and the most robust year there are 70 different countries reporting. But even though you don't have every country reporting at every point in time, you do have this issue of import-export. So when you pool all of the data, you end up getting you get 196 different countries with drug information about their position within the drug trafficking. because you're looking at two sides of the same coin, right? So if we know that drugs are going from Pakistan to Afghanistan, but Afghanistan doesn't report, sorry, if we suspect there's if Pakistan reports that there's drug traffic going from Pakistan to Afghanistan, but Afghanistan doesn't report, then we've captured the information even though it hasn't been confirmed by the second country. Sorry, it took me a minute to explain that. So what if we look at the data quality? So what happens in the UN drug seizure data is that oftentimes nations will only report that they've about a seizure, but they won't report the origin of where the drug came from or the intended destination of where that package was going. So you end up with getting a lot of missing dyadic information, meaning that we don't know where the drugs were coming and going. We just know it was seized somewhere. The country that is most troublesome for this is Spain. Spain does a beautiful job reporting consistently to the UN all of the seizures that qualify, and that's fantastic. However, there's an issue with the details that are provided. So let me explain the graph that you're looking at. This is an EgoNet for Afghanistan. So this is building the entire network, pulling all of the information that we have from all of the different reports over the 7-year period, and then extracting Afghanistan and all of the trade partners directly connected to Afghanistan and the connections among those trade partners. So it's a sub-network from the larger network. Afghanistan has a little green circle around it because that's the focus of this investigation. The symbols are, the size varies based on something called degree centrality. In this case, it is out degree centrality, so sending something out of the country. Yeah, exporting. And the bigger size means that there's more reports of stuff coming out of the country. The color coding tells us whether or not we actually have complete information. So if a seizure is reported, but we don't know the origin or the destination, that information cannot be included in the network. So if it's a black circle, that means 76 to 100% of what they report for seizures does not include origin and or destination, which means we know very little about their position within the global trade of drugs. If you see a white symbol, that means 0 to 25% is incomplete, which means that more of the information is being included in the network. So based on the color coding here, you start to see where we might be deficient in our information. There could be many more trading partners that are sending drugs to Afghanistan that we don't know about. Italy, as you can see, we don't really know the origin of the drugs coming into Italy because a lot of the information that is reported by the authorities is missing that detail. We know a lot about how the drugs are coming into Spain, and we can map those associations. What about export, or what about intended destination? If we map the intended destination information, or if we map the network, pulling that EgoNet, and then we color code each of the countries based on whether or not we do have a lot of information about the intended destination, the picture changes quite dramatically. Most countries in this network do not have complete information about where the drugs were going. So we end up seeing that a lot of countries will report that they had a seizure, where it came from, or they'll report the seizure as being internal. So they captured the drugs at an internal domestic airport, but they knew it came from someplace else, but they weren't sure. So it's just, it's what we call a recursive loop. Anyway, it can't be mapped. No, it shouldn't be mapped because we don't have full information. So when we do this, we see that most of the countries in this EgoNet, we don't really know the intended destination of the drugs that were seized. Very different from the origin, right? So from the origin, we know a little bit about what's going on in Pakistan, Korea, Spain, and Azerbaijan. There are some other places that drugs are coming in that we're not sure where they're coming from. But when it comes to destination, we have an even poorer picture of what's happening. So that's actor attributes. We're using information about the country to color code those symbols so that we can better understand where we might be deficient in information. We can target more resources into understanding what's happening there, or we can calibrate the networks in order to identify that their roles are potentially biased in terms of the estimates. The other thing we can do is we can look at the relational attributes. So we can also look at what's going on in terms of what's being reported. In this graphic, again, we're looking at Afghanistan. That's our EGONet for Afghanistan. The dark, I gotta move my head here. The dark lines that are double-headed arrows, you see that? That is a situation where the drug channel operates in both directions and it's being reported consistently. So over the years, it doesn't matter what year you pull the data for, you're going to see that relationship existing. So we see that there is a flow of drugs between Nigeria and Spain. It goes in both directions. It's reported consistently. Every year we hear about that. The dotted gray lines are the lines that exist, maybe, or the ties that we have information about in 1 year, maybe 2 years, but we often don't get that information reported in the drug seizures. Okay, so if you look at this graphic, suddenly you can see the position that Italy is in. We know that consistently we find seizures that are linking Italy and Spain. So the drugs have come from Spain or they're headed to Spain. What we don't get on a regular basis is the connection between Nigeria and Italy, India and Italy, and Afghanistan and Italy. Those relationships only come up in some years. So by pooling information for multiple years, we end up having a more complete picture of what potentially is going on, even though that information is not fully confirmed because we've only maybe captured it once or twice. What I find really interesting are those lines that are black and also dotted, which means that we know about drugs consistently coming from one direction to another, but not in the return. So in this graphic, you see that we always have information about drugs coming from Afghanistan to Spain, but very rarely do we see that the information about seizures reported tells us information about drugs coming from Spain and going to Afghanistan. So now I'm hoping that you're feeling a little bit better about the prospects of diving into some dirty data and playing with it with networks, and that you've thought about, or that I've convinced you that the challenges that we deal with in terms of our data and our data quality can be reconfigured or rethought so that we can turn those into opportunities to explore those networks. If you want to learn more, there are some resources that are absolutely fantastic. Bright Brewer and Morcelli just came out with an article that really does a good job of systematically reviewing all sorts of different types of criminal justice data that get used to analyze networks. And that catalogs all of the different challenges and the ways people have been dealing with it. If in your world you spend more of your time with surveillance data, Campana and Varese have done a really good job of coming up with ideas about how can we trust surveillance data and in what situations you can make conclusions that can be generalized to other situations. So for criminal justice data, definitely look at the Bright piece that's just come out in social networks. If you work more with surveillance data, the Campana piece is actually probably the best to look at. If you're in a situation where you're working with really, really large graphs, and we're talking upwards of 500,000, maybe I don't know, large might be 1,000 and above. But we get into really large networks. The issue that I haven't mentioned so far is something called entity resolution, meaning that you cannot have individuals in the network represented with different entities. Right? So you could have a person, think of it in terms of bank accounts, right? A person could have multiple bank accounts and you need to resolve that and give them one unique identity because you don't want their influence in the network to be fractured into different symbols in that sense. I'll draw a picture for you in your mind. You could also think of it if you've got a lot of email accounts or social media accounts and you're trying to harvest information to figure out what the community of actors are. People may have different account names, but they're the same person. So you have to resolve that and make sure that each account or each entity that's in your network only represents one being or one person. And I would look at Robinson's recent work about reference graphs and some ideas that have been posed to resolve these issues. In terms of simulation modeling, if that's what you're doing, there's been an excellent paper that came out of a group of Dutch researchers that provides some ideas about how to deal with this dirty data situation when you're trying to estimate how a group might react to targeted law enforcement action. Now, if you just want methodology, I was so appreciative of the plug earlier. If you just want some information about methodology, some sampling techniques, some general tips about collecting data and cleaning data, then I would recommend the Understanding Criminal Networks book for a couple of reasons. Number one, it doesn't assume that you know anything about networks, so it's a really good entry point. Those other pieces I mentioned are academic pieces, so they do assume you know something about in terms of the language and the jargon that's being used. And this book was written with the idea of people don't know anything about the topic, so it'll be a more comfortable read. It was also designed to read wherever you do your best thinking. So maybe that's commuting, sitting beside a barbecue, or someplace else that's quiet and reflective. So you shouldn't have any problems getting through this book. So I hope that in this talk, you've gotten some ideas and maybe have been inspired to start playing with network data. And that when you come across those challenges and you start banging your head against a wall because the data just don't seem to be rich enough, that you have some strategies that you can use to overcome those challenges.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bichler, for this great talk on social network. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand in the chat or just type into the chat and we'll get you unmuted. And I don't quite see one popping up yet. So I'll sort of start off the questions here. I think one thing that I was super interested in seeing you discuss are the temporal aspects of networks. I think a lot of times we get stuck looking at the static picture, and it seems like we can actually get more information from observing the dynamics. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
One of the fundamental assumptions that people make that are network scientists is that the network is constantly changing. And because we spend so much, because our data is so poor, we tend to collapse a lot of years or a lot of observations together to get a more rich or complete picture. But you're right, we need to then disentangle that in order to understand how things have shifted over time, or use multiple smaller windows. So for instance, Andy Papachristos, who's done a lot of research into gang violence, uses a 2-year window. So by collapsing 2 years of gang violence together and then looking at that and how it's shifting over time, it's possible to actually map out the contagion of violence and how the violence spreads within different communities. And I think you could use that strategy in other areas using a 1 or 2 year window where you're collapsing all of your intelligence in that smaller time frame.
Excellent, thank you. Up next, we have Jim Cheatham. Jim, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to ask your question.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering, when we saw that there was a lack of certain data for some countries, is that due to the role of organized crime?
It could be. It could also just be an issue of resources or warfare or other things that might get in the way, and that country isn't in a position to actually supply that data that year. So it could be an intentional hiding of information, or it could be a situational problem, or it could be a resource issue. When it comes, and I think it depends on the nature of the data. So for instance, we spent a lot of time looking at a military grade small arms and light weapons and found that that is more of a political issue, even though data is supposed to be supplied about movements of weapons, it doesn't get supplied by all nations in each direction. So you might be able to pick up information about what the United States is exporting to Israel, but then Israel doesn't tell you where it's sending the weapons.
Okay, thank you.
Another question that I sort of had, and for me, I like the idea that we start connecting individuals through potential interactions. And I think you sort of mentioned this at the end, but can we speak towards maybe finding potential missing persons, right? And I think that's always one of the gaps, right? Like, we might not know everybody and how they're interacting, but if we could maybe infer who we might be missing.
There are a couple of different ways to think about that. One is with that multiplexity. So to give you a clear example, there was a police department working on a nightclub that was causing a lot of trouble in the neighborhood. They were a very popular nightclub, so they were bringing in people from about a 50-mile radius. And violence was starting to happen. The bouncers were known to be involved in the drug trade. Things were spilling out over into the hotels in the area. And the best I can say is it's the happiest place on earth. It was no longer happy. So they started this really intensive operation trying to figure out what was going on and put a lot of pressure on what they perceived to be as the owner. Well, afterwards, one of the detectives on the case was reading the newspaper on a Sunday morning and was reading a bunch of civil actions and hearings that were, I don't know, just was reading the paper, and discovered that there was a hearing that was going to happen about the liquor license for that particular location. Well, it turns out the names on the liquor license did not match the names that the police department knew to be the operators of that place. So it turns out that the sister of the secretary that was working there, her name was on the liquor license unknown to her. And the person who actually ran and owned the nightclub lived in Sacramento and had never set foot on the place. So in terms of finding those hidden connections, I really think that those legitimate business connections, if you're talking about organized crime and that sort of thing, or drug trading, or kinship relationships, are going to be really important into potentially filling in the gap. Now, you're going to capture a lot of people that are not part of the network and have absolutely, they shouldn't be labeled criminal at all. They've got nothing to do with it. But they could inadvertently be supporting and playing supporting roles. So I would include them in the network and then exclude them once you've investigated.
Okay, I think that's sort of one of the issues that I think we're interested in here is, we have some students here analyzing, social media data. And what we see is that network gets huge. And while there's value in, let's say, value in understanding the complete network, there's sensitivities about, well, this person B is not involved in any sort of criminal or extremist activity, but there's sort of a bridging gap, right? And I think to your point with the grandmother, right? Whether the grandmother is in on it or not, she's the connecting puzzle piece through a common activity.
Yeah. There are different ways there are community detection algorithms that can be deployed to reduce the noise, right? That's what you're talking about, taking out those extras. The other thing that I think is useful is there have been some efforts to identify characteristics, right? So when it comes to looking at online cyber markets to identify the sellers that are offering stolen goods, there are a series of characteristics of the seller, right? So we know that the account is 12 days or less in terms of age of the account. They're offering a variety of different materials, not just what is the target, right? So maybe you're looking at, let's say, laptops or motorcycles or baby formula. They have other things for sale that seem a little strange. They're offering for fixed price if it's an auction site. They're offering usually the products at 20% below market value. So you can come up with this list of characteristics that can then be used to rank the probability that that particular seller is involved in illicit trade. And I think you can do the same with social media, that you could rank based on either the person's characteristics or their role within the network or different things that they're posting, right, to actually gauge the probability that they're involved and then use that to trim out people from the network. We've done something similar with gangs, looking at gang activity on social media, that there are certain characteristics that would suggest the person's involved in gang activity. And that way you can take the full network and you can delete all the people that don't seem to have those characteristics in their profiles.
And sorry, just one follow-up question. How has, I think it's one thing for us to study this as academics, but, how do, I guess, law enforcement agencies and other organizations typically respond to this idea of collecting a lot of data potentially on uninvolved actors, right? Or can you speak towards anonymizing some of this data, right?
Well, the data that I showed in terms of that drug trafficking network was completely anonymized for analysis purposes, right? So the original documents have names and there is some filtering that occurs. So it's not everybody that the people are connected to, but it would be, for instance, there was an individual who was involved in laundering money, and they were using their wife's real estate license to buy property and launder money in that way. They were also using some local smaller businesses, cash businesses. So in that situation, you may not include all of the kinship ties or all the legitimate business ties, but you would actually include the ones that were connected to the illicit activity, whether they knew about it or not. They would be in the network for a period of time. We've done some work also in Indonesia looking at drug trafficking, smuggling into Indonesia. And one of the things that was raised was, well, just because somebody's connected doesn't mean they're knowingly connected. So why label them the deviant? Well, you're not actually labeling them deviant. You're just saying they're involved in the network somehow, knowingly or not knowingly. So in this particular case, there are fishermen that were observed picking up a parcel in the dead of night in international waters, putting it in with the fish, sailing into Indonesian waters, offloading it in the middle of the night to another vessel that was waiting, and that vessel brought it to shore. Later, it was determined that it was seized and it was methamphetamine. Did the fishermen know? They knew they were taking something in the middle of the night and dropping it off someplace else. Did they know it was meth? Don't know. Is that relevant? No, because you're trying to figure out the mechanisms that are being used to smuggle the drugs into the country. So I think it also depends on the purpose, right? So in that case, somebody's involvement is more important than their culpability.
Yeah, I think it's, fascinating to look at the function of individuals and the relationships and how they're activated. I think our next question, we had a hand raised from Cynthia. Cynthia, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation today and to come to our seminar. That was great. My question follow up like Dr. Zala's question, because we are in a very complex world and society. So the use of social media is getting like every day more and more influential in our daily lives. So I would like to know, like, as you said that you already did this before, you already did a study using social media information. Do you believe that the content inside the post and how the language works in criminal networks, that could help to build better relationship between the criminals? And how do you think that can help you to enhance the quality of the data you have?
So what your comment is that there's text. So often in social media, you've got text and comments and responses from other people. And then you also have images, right? The social media that you're looking at has a bunch of different pieces to it. And I would say, yes, that in order to identify who's involved.
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself.
In order to identify who's actually a material person that should be connected in that network, I would use all of those pieces. So what you can do is take, for instance, we've done this with trying to disentangle human trafficking networks from social media. So you know of a few people that are definitely involved. And what you can do is you can analyze their posts, their language to create a profile, then that gets used to filter out the rest. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And do you believe like we can start from the social media information, or you think that we have to have some outside information to start building the network?
People have done it in both directions, and I think you need to have a little bit of intelligence. You need to have a starting point, a seed. We call it seeds in social network analysis. If you have some critical seeds that you know, or you are very confident are involved in something, then you can use those to actually build your profiles to use as filters, right? So that you can filter people out or include. You can use it as a filter out or as an inclusion. And that will help clean up those networks and take out a lot of that extra noise that's not relevant. And then what I would do is apply a community detection algorithm to then identify pockets of people that might be, again, we're always using the word might be part of it.
So I'm gonna,
that's perfect.
I'm gonna ask a question. We actually have a team of students working on community detection. So do you, and I think one of the questions that they want to know is, do you have a favorite community detection algorithm that you use?
No, but I would caution that a lot of them are cohesion based. And covert networks are always, not always, covert networks have the tendency not to be cohesive. What you're going to do is you're going to identify the pockets that are tightly connected, but you're not going to identify the individuals that actually bridge those gaps that are the more critical individuals in the network.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question. I see a question popping up. And then, but before that, hold on, I'm going to share my screen. I want to encourage everybody to attend an upcoming seminar, our next seminar. So let's see. So before everybody starts jumping off, on April 7th, we're going to have Aisha Javid Karisha from the National Institute of Justice talk to us about domestic radicalization and terrorism research that's going on at NIJ in the Department of Justice. So this should be a very exciting talk. And so please come on April 7th to see that. I think that'll be very fascinating. As a last question, I wanted to ask about the time, and we might have one more after me. We'll do two more. The ties between illicit networks and terrorism. Are they operating on completely different network structures? Or do we have any hope of identifying those networks, I guess, and those connections?
I don't, is your question about the actual characteristics of the network or the individuals involved?
I want to say the characteristics of the network. So specifically, let's say we're talking about, local ground players, drug dealers at one network who are, connected to larger drug trafficking groups who are essentially funding helping to support or fund terrorist activities, right? So you have these three sort of networks that are connected but don't necessarily know, and they each might exhibit different network structures within their communities.
Right. So the first thing to keep in mind is that networks, they're not organized from the top down. A business might be organized from the top down. So you may have components of the network that are, right? If they're taking a business model or a military model and they're organizing how the reporting structures, right? But generally speaking, most criminal networks are individuals and their direct connections. That's what they know. That's their worldview, right? It's me and all the people I know that I'm working with. And I may have some knowledge of the people that they're connected to, but I do not have a bird's eye perspective looking at the entire network. That entire network structure, the structure of the whole community, emerges from all of the decisions of all these people at the local level and the connections that they have at the local level. So when we look at these networks, we tend to find some very similar characteristics. Individuals with high betweenness, meaning that they connect groups of people who are not directly connected themselves. And people who have high degree centrality, meaning that they have lots of connections, so they're hubs, those individuals are visible in the network and they tend to be very important. Are they key leaders? Could be. They could also be the mouthpiece for the key leaders, for better, the operational command as opposed to the theoretical command. So those people can be identified. We find them all the time, and we find similar structures around them. Is that, is the commonality because we all have our data are weak? I don't know. Time will tell when we fill in those gaps. But so yes, there are commonalities that can be identified, and people who are critical to the flow of the network are similarly positioned in different networks.
I have like 5 other questions for you, but we'll follow up with them another time. We're going to end with Lauren Prada. If she could, let's see, I got to ask her to unmute herself and she can go ahead and ask her question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi. So I was about to ask a question, right? I was like trying to raise my hand in here as Dr. Vela asked about community detection. But I kind of want to ask, how much do you or your colleagues use these kind of community detection algorithms in your work? Because I'm part of this project that he mentioned, that he's working on it. So just like how, or as far as you know, like how many times can you find yourself like applying this or using it?
I personally don't use it a lot to find communities per se, in terms of taking a large swath of people and then finding a crime group. Instead, I'm taking what is thought to be a known crime group and finding smaller communities within them that are more tightly connected that might represent a cell.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Yeah,
you're taking it at a much larger or a different viewpoint. You're looking a bit bigger and trying to find those groups. And my suggestion is those groups are important, but also whatever connects those groups to others. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of research looking at roles. So you actually aggregate up to different roles within the activity that you're looking at. So drug retailers, to have an easy kind of, you can take the drug buyers and the retailers and aggregate them up to that role. And then finding the ones that are actually wholesale or middle level, and then the ones that are in the source, identifying that flow, right, is important. So if we were looking at terrorism, I would say you want to identify the people that are involved in bankrolling everything. That's a different, potentially different group, could be some overlapping, than people that are involved in strategy or military operations. And then that's different from the people that might be involved in actually implementing something. Right, so your cells on the ground, they're not going to have all the information about everything that's going on, right? They may not be involved in the money. They may not be involved in converting stuff into money. They are going to show up as being highly connected potentially if you have full information. But it's those other ones in between that become critical. Zhu and Shen have done some really interesting work. I would look at some of their stuff. Who else? I can give you a list of things. Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of them, but it's really important to capture those other connections, or else, oh yeah, no worries. You're going to miss something. You're going to find the group that are highly connected, but they may not be the ones you really want to deal with. We did some work with some data that we pulled from West Point when they released all of that information that had been seized in the Abbottabad raids. And we actually mapped out the Al-Qaeda information structure from what we were able to retrieve. And then they released some information from ISIS, and we actually were able to integrate that, and it became one giant network because 8 people from the one network were also in the other network. But then when we tried to take that information and connect it up to others, the warrior names and the identifiers that we had for individuals were different. So we couldn't actually glue it together with other sources of information because our ID representations were not the same. So it becomes very complicated when you're looking at really large sets.
Yeah, I see.
So if you can, so that's what I would build from the ground up instead of, and maybe do it from both directions and see what's consistent or robust, right? So you take some seeds, randomly select seeds or select seeds purposely that you know are involved, build out the networks from them, then take your community detection algorithms, run those, find the communities, and see to what degree those two things overlap.
Great, thank you for your answer. That's really, really helpful.
You're welcome.
Alrighty, with that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you, Dr. Bichler, for this wonderful presentation. And I'll just say one thing, and this is, again, a little asterisk. I meant to put this at the head of the hour. This seminar series, of course, is sponsored by DHS and NCITE, but of course, none of the opinions or anything we say here reflects the opinions or policies or anything whatsoever regarding DHS or the United States government. But that said, we do thank them for supporting this seminar series. And again, thank you, Dr. Bichler, for your presentation.
You're welcome.
All righty. And again, please join us again on April 7th for an inside look at NIJ and some of their work that they're doing on radicalization and terrorism. All right, have a great weekend, guys. Bye-bye.